Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I have the privilege of reading out the statement from this conference at the request of the Secretariat. This statement has become a good friend of mine over the last couple of weeks, and I recognize that it's a little bit longer than it could be, but this is because of its inclusive nature. So bear with me as I read it to you. You should have a hard copy of it in front of you. Addressing the health of vulnerable populations for an inclusive society. We, Ministers of Health, other ministries as may be applicable, representatives of government institutions, civil society organizations, communities, the private sector, and development partners, participants of the Prince Mahidol Award Conference 2017, gathered in Bangkok 1st to 3rd of February 2017 to learn and share experiences, reaffirming the right to health enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the World Health Organization Constitution, and the 1978 Direct Declaration of Alma-Ata, welcoming the vision of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development for a society that is just, equitable, and inclusive, and its pledge to leave no one behind without distinction of any kind, such as age, sexual orientation, and gender identity and expression, disability, culture, race, ethnicity, origin, migratory status, religion, economic, or any other status. Noting global evidence on the negative consequences of health inequity, discrimination, stigma, and marginalization on individuals, families, and groups, and the high cost to economies, societies, and broader development efforts of social and political exclusion. Also noting the particular burden of ill health faced by women and girls due to increased vulnerability, disempowerment, and the burden they face caring for the sick. Recognizing the implementation of essential public health functions and moving towards universal health coverage and human security requires strengthening of governance and public health capacities, a fit-for-purpose health and social sector workforce, and with decent jobs, and an explicit focus on identifying and meeting the needs of vulnerable populations and populations at risk, including ensuring effective access to health information, affordable care, equitable and sustainable access to life-saving technologies, as well as addressing trade-related barriers that hamper accessibility of essential medicines by adopting TRIPS flexibilities. Aware of the critical role of geographic and affinity communities in reversing social exclusion and advancing health and health equity, and acknowledging that reaching those most excluded requires strengthening of community systems, enhancing of community health systems, and empowering politically marginalized groups, including women and girls, children and adolescents, young people, older persons in need of long-term care, people living with HIV and TB and other key populations, persons with disabilities, migrants and mobile populations, internally displaced populations and refugees, stateless people, LGBTI, and indigenous people in decision-making. Welcoming the report that resulted from the 2016 United Nations Secretary-General's High-Level Commission on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth, and the United Nations General Assembly Resolution, Global Health and Foreign Policy, Health, Employment, and Economic Growth, underscoring the importance of intersectoral strategies and investments into the health and social sector workforce for universal health coverage and inclusive growth for all. Welcoming the report of the United Nations Secretary-General's High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines, and in particular, its call for greater investments in biomedical research and development for diseases of the poor, and its recommendations to increase transparency and cooperation across the public and private sectors to ensure affordable and sustainable access to life-saving technologies. Recalling the Rio Political Declaration on the Social Determinants of Health, which reaffirmed that health inequities within and between countries are politically, socially, and economically unacceptable, as well as unfair and largely avoidable. Recalling the United Nations Resolution on Global Health and Foreign Policy, endorsing the concept of UHC, and urging investments in health with the aim to ensure universal access to the basic health services while protecting from financial hardships, with particular focus on those most in need, including the poor, vulnerable population groups, and those in rural and remote areas. Also recalling the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants that expresses the political will of world leaders to save lives, protect rights, and share responsibility to benefit refugees, migrants, those who assist them, and their host countries and communities. Agree to work together and across sectors and levels to advance the health of vulnerable and marginalized populations, promote social inclusion, and tackle the root causes of health inequities and the economic, social, and environmental determinants of health in particular. National governments, in partnership with civil society organizations and communities, and with support from development partners, as appropriate, to develop and strengthen capacities to measure and understand the causes of health inequities and monitor progress on social inclusion of vulnerable and excluded populations at the national and subnational level. Increase the allocation of domestic financial resources to strengthen national health systems and promote the adaptation of reform of laws, policies, and practices to ensure the rights and dignity of people and address the determinants and consequences of social exclusion, stigma, and discrimination, removing barriers to social integration and well-being, promoting and protecting human rights, particularly through adequate social protection floors and coordinated health, social, and economic policies, and accelerating progress towards universal health coverage. Ensure that community, civil society, historically excluded groups, and the general public can engage in and inform the design, delivery, and accountability of policies, services, programs, and initiatives, and effectively claim their rights. Develop and enforce measures to prohibit any form of discrimination. Encourage government agencies responsible for public health, trade, intellectual property, and human rights to review their interrelating laws and address incoherence of those laws, with the advancement of the public health interests as priority. Ensure that bilateral and regional trade and investment agreements will not have any adverse consequences to the public health, especially access to life-saving medicines. Development partners, including international organizations, bilateral, regional, and multilateral banks, foundations, and others, support efforts to build the institutional, administrative, and scientific capacity of governments and civil society for integrated, multi-sectoral, and participatory approaches to health and health equity, access to justice, and universal health coverage. Facilitate South-South and triangular exchange of knowledge and experience across countries and regions, especially with regards to achieving the targets of Sustainable Development Goals 3 and 17, and realizing the co-benefits for health and other sectors through action across other goals. Work together and identify ways towards inclusive partnership with non-traditional stakeholders, such as, but not limited to, the private sector, academia, private foundations, while increasing their accountability towards the broader society. Support the development of resilient and sustainable systems for health which are people-centered and which enable communities to make their full contribution to improving health, paying particular attention to vulnerable and excluded communities. All stakeholders, including industry, academia, professional organizations, health workers, and others, invest in building and strengthening the evidence base and understanding of the particular needs and barriers of vulnerable populations to health in order to understand appropriate solutions, including through incentives and innovations to ensure that socially excluded groups can better access health and other services. Identify social, economic, environmental, and global security co-benefits of greater health equity, and encourage action on the structural determinants of health and health inequities to realize them. Encourage actions outside the health sector to promote gender equality and human rights, ensure better policy coherence and service quality, including on reducing corruption, reducing predatory industry marketing practices, and any other discriminatory practices which can have a particularly negative impact on the health of vulnerable populations. This ends the statement. So, thank you for all of those that engaged in this statement. It was quite an effort, a collective effort, and I hope it is accepted by the conference. Thank you.